Hey everyone, I'm Adam Doyle. I'm an artist and illustrator. I'm here with my friend Jay Neely. Jay and I have known each other for a bunch of years. We met over D&D in role-playing. And I thought that the conversations that we've had over the years have been so stimulating and enjoyable. Jay's a really terrifically inquisitive guy and gets a lot out of me, so I thought that not only having a conversation with him, but recording it would be a fun thing and possibly of interest to folks. So that's what prompted this. So
Awesome.
Hands it over to Jay.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to picking your brain and having answers recorded. It's always useful for future conversations to be able to go back and say, no, you said this. You said this. I know that you think this.
Oh man, we're like a couple. Yeah.
So, hey everyone, I'm Jay Neely. I'm a marketing consultant by day, but really I just have a lot of fun being a creative person in general. And as Adam said, I mean, D&D and other kind of gaming, tabletop adventure games have been part of my life for 20 years now, since high school essentially. And we've had a lot of good conversations as creatives of very different types, but both with a deep interest in story and kind of the meta creation of that. I think you and I are both very fascinated by process.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you in this conversation today about a process question that's been on my mind a lot as I think about tabletop gaming that I want to do in the future and creating an original setting for that. And that's really about the role of originality within genre worlds, which I think is something that you probably deal with as an illustrator working in other people's very specific worlds, often that exist within a genre quite a lot. But also in your own kind of work as an artist. I think you're aware that your work doesn't exist in a vacuum. You definitely know of what some of your influences are and often are creating works within what are very well-defined genres that we're both fans of, like fantasy. Or I know that you have an interest in kind of horror and cosmic horror and the Cthulhu mythos and things like that. And so that's come out in some of your work. And you've gotten the opportunity to work specifically within that franchise a little bit as well. And so really I just wanted to ask you about what is your goal when you're aware that you're working within a genre and you want to create something new? Where do you draw that line between original versus archetype?
What I'm always at the service of is the material, the story. But in terms of like finding that balance between serving the needs of the story, which is encapsulated in a genre, with a desire for is that like a fuel for originality? Yeah, like those are all the components, but it really has to be unpacked in a way that's specific. Like a specific piece, I could unpack that. But speaking generally, I would basically say that your question is the answer, which is yes, it's a juggling act between the needs of the story, understanding the genre as it's perceived by viewers.
Let me maybe take a different example of,
Sure.
For like Netrunner,
Yeah.
which you did the cards for. It's a collectible card game. I mean, it exists as a cyberpunk genre kind of franchise. And often those cards do have something kind of very specific that they're asking you to create an illustration for. Within that, I mean, how do you approach, sure, there's lots of specific archetypes that exist within the cyberpunk genre. Like it'd be easy to just put a guy with neon goggles on, to do that as an illustration. When you're thinking more broadly, I mean, how do you separate out the archetypes that you associate with the genre from your own original ideas of what you might want to create within that world?
It's funny that you brought up genre, because I do work in genres and I enjoy it, but I guess I have a kind of a weird relationship with genre. With Netrunner, the reason that relationship works so well is because when I got involved right at the very beginning of that, the first edition of the game I was involved with. So the briefs initially, and then throughout the whole series for the following, whatever it was, 6 years, it was always in this sort of cyberpunk space. But initially it was the reference point. There were fewer reference points because there was Tron, there was Neuromancer and Matrix. So like cyberpunk exists, but in Netrunner, the goal was more sort of foraging ahead and having a sense of what cyberpunk landscape looks like. And basically every card that I got was essentially within the computer generated landscape. The imagery that dealt with people and jacking in and that whole out at real world. What I learned the term was one time the art director used the term meat space, and I had no idea what she was talking about. It was meat space. So yeah, there was basically the invitation. What worked well for me is within. I guess the short answer is what works well for me within genre is some sense of boundaries, having a sense of like a goal, like a world that we're living in. But then from there, I do better with invention that rather than replication. So as a point of comparison, I would say that I've not been invited, and I don't think I'd really want to work on Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or something like that, because that requires a real interest in accuracy to a world that already exists, and I'm more comfortable, and I enjoy more worlds that like the broad strokes exist, but then it's up to me to figure it out and make it look like it fits.
Yeah, to be honest, I think that with Netrunner, it was I wasn't really thinking about archetypes as much as just trying to avoid cliches and capture a cyberspace feel with everything that I was creating, that so that it felt like it all belonged in one cohesive world.
So I think that's one of the things I'm interested in digging in on is that difference between a franchise world versus a genre world. Because I totally hear you on why you might not be interested in doing something in Star Wars specifically, right? There's a very specific style guide that I have to imagine that they have for the Jedi. And similarly for like Wizards of the Coast for Magic the Gathering, I know that they have very specific style guides for all of their cards and their characters, etc. That is very different from your opportunity to create within the broader genre of fantasy, and in Magic the Gathering style, like kind of a high fantasy, a high magic fantasy. But I think those broad strokes, as you've called it, that a genre provides, they're really useful for me as a tabletop GM, to be able to say to my players, all right, within this world that we're playing in, there are 3 races: humans, elves, and dwarves. Instantly, my players understand what those races are, almost always, and have a general sense of the stereotype of how those members of those races behave and their relationships with each other and all of that other stuff. And for me as a GM who is creating a world where the races are part of it, but there's also the locations, there's the individual people, there's the stories, etc. To be able to have something like that, that just like all I have to do is give you 3 words and you understand what's a huge part of that world, that's really convenient, but it's certainly not original. And it's something that I actually don't really do as a GM that much. I would much prefer to change the names a little bit and say that these are like elves, but the Sylvan people have these traits in addition to it. And we don't have dwarves, we have Dwugar, however you say that word, and they're very specifically, the evil version. They're not crafty, they're tricksters, etc. And where I'm going with this is there are a lot of things that the archetypes of a genre can give you to work with, where if you can take 90% of what they have there, it's 90% that you don't have to create, and it frees you to be much more detailed and original, I think, in the 10% that you can create. But it does become difficult to communicate the differences when you are basing it off of something that is so well known to folks. I want to get your response to that, but first by showing, if I can share my screen, a really good example, I think, of what I'm talking about here. So that is dragons. You can see what's on my screen now?
Yep.
All right, so I think dragons are a really good example of this.
Right.
Dragons only exist as an archetype built off of our shared experience of fiction over, at this point, centuries of storytelling. Yeah. And so you've done a number of dragons, and I'll click through a couple of these real quick that I find, just really interesting, certainly unique and original, but clearly inspired by our shared understanding of what a dragon is. Mm-hmm. This piece right here is from your Virus series, and this is totally my interpretation of it, but certainly it seems to have some dragon influences in it. I don't think that I'm crazy to say maybe I detect a hint of a snout and some eyes here, and the horns and spikes and the cloud of smoke. I mean, it has a very dragon-esque feeling to it. So I think several of these pieces are good examples of dragons in different forms and how they've come out of your work. Yeah. I mean, for you, this is, I would think, an example of you're clearly creating based off of a genre here. Yeah. Would you agree, disagree?
No, I totally agree. I totally agree.
And so when you're trying to create these images here, what would you say are kind of the goals of being original with these? Do you think about how to make your dragons different from other dragons out there?
Yeah, I mean, dragons are probably a great point of discussion for this, for the concept of genre and your questions, because they don't exist. We all agree they don't exist, but we also have pretty specific ideas or understanding from culture of what they look like. So yeah, I do enjoy painting dragons, but I also do have feelings about what I'm sort of advocating for, I guess, by creating them, because they're imaginary. I'm advocating, in the way I depict them, as largely being benevolent for the most part, or maybe having like an evilness, but I don't think I have, nor would I have much interest in showing a dragon that's, I don't know, they tend to be like intelligent, which is, again, traditional. I tend to focus a bit more on Western type dragons than Eastern, although I do have a bit of a gripe with Western dragon anatomy. And I don't actually know I know that, so dragons have been around for a long time. King Arthur days, they were called worms or serpents. They had other names for them. You can go back to, Beowulf with Grendel and Epic of Gilgamesh, but sort of like how dragons have kind of conceptually evolved. But specifically, the issue I have is with 4 limbs and wings, because that's kind of more insect-like, and I don't know, I just have a little bit of a problem with the idea of a dragon having 6 limbs, because it just seems like that's a lot for a brain to handle. Octopuses can handle stuff like that, but they also have like a different neurology. Their brain is kind of wired throughout their limbs. Yeah, so I technically I kind of am more into wyverns, I guess, anatomically. So that's kind of what I lean towards, painting wise.
Well, but this is what I'm saying. I mean, that's interesting. Of like, you're aware that there is an alternate subgenre of dragon called wyverns that is anatomically more linked to what you create with dragons, but it's not like anyone is the authority on this subject, where it's set in stone, right? Like with fantasy creatures, if you were working within a certain franchise, right? If you were working with D&D, there would be a hard distinction between dragons and wyverns and the difference between them. But within the open world of art, if you make a painting of something and say this is a dragon, people's only basis to argue with you is their own opinions. And for you, what I'm really interested in is the argument that you have with yourself while creating something about what this is when you're creating it, and whether it comes from I want to create a dragon, and therefore that is this. It has 4 limbs, not 6. Or if it's I want to create this, a winged, fire-breathing, I'm assuming, creature with wings and kind of lizard-like, but larger. And I know that is popularly considered to be a dragon, and I'm going to try to push that this is what a dragon is into the world.
Yeah, there's definitely a part of that. Participating in a sort of a shared agreement of something imagined, and then within that, nudging it one way or the other in terms of what I think is what makes it useful, and sort of how it operates. Because it's imagined, how does it operate for our shared narrative, I guess? Like I'm using it in ways that I feel like is fulfilling like an idea. Although, you also just showed there's times where I'm basically just sort of like dragon porn, in the sense that it's like dragons are cool, so I just painted a dragon. I try not to do too much of that in general. I try to sort of expect of myself that I'm making stuff has like some degree of like there's a concept there or communicating something there, not just getting too nerdy or geeky about the details. In this one, it was partly motivated by, okay, I'll do a dragon, a conventional dragon, but I'll bring in this thing that's been like an ongoing motif of mine, which is this like internal churning, vibrant energy. So I guess there's also a degree of that, using the convention as a means to relay or continue or propagate like personal interests. So just in the questions, like I'm totally on board with your questions and curiosity around playing with that balance between genre conventions and personal exploration. So with GMing, with running games and world building, you're relying upon conventions. If something is taking place in a fantasy setting or a sci-fi setting, and you were talking about the examples of elf-like characters. Like you could just have characters, D&D characters, where it's the elf and a goblin and an orc and a human, but you have a similar interest in having the characters be elf-like or gnome-like. So talk a little bit about that, like, because it's something about like having players understand a shorthand, but also not having it be so limiting that they're stuck in that sort of typecast, right?
Typecasting is a really good word, and so I'll hone in on that, because I think for me, my interest in using archetypes within storytelling is to be able to provide a shorthand to give people the outline of what they're dealing with. But the details, I still want to fill in. I'm interested in my GMing specifically in telling human stories about human interaction. And where my settings tend to differ from D&D and its many franchises within that, which do have a large number of fantasy races, and players can play those fantasy races, and it just ends up being, I think, a way of creating just alternate types of people that give you an excuse to act in a certain way, because that's how that race acts, essentially. And I don't find that interesting. I don't want to have a player hate dwarves because they're an elf, and that's what elves do.
Totally.
That's not interesting to me.
Right.
If a player's character is going to hate a person, I want it to be because there's a vendetta between their character and that character, or between their family and that character's family. You know, I want there to be a personal connection to it.
Yeah.
Or I want them to, so that's that. My interest in putting in other races into fantasy is to create a different type of being that brings in a fantastical element into the world, that is a non-human element. They are connected to an element or to a theme, that there should still be personality and detail there to make it feel like there's a person when we're talking about a person, but they're not a player character. If I'm creating a fantastical race, I might want people to get the broad strokes of this is an elf-like creature, and it values some of these things, but I don't want that to take over their thinking about it. And that's where I feel like archetypes have the downside of, because it is based on a shared experience of other works, is where these archetypes, especially for fantasy creatures, comes from. There are also a lot of assumptions that come along with that, which you might not want to be included in your specific instance of that archetype.
When you are role playing, one of the things I love role playing is I'm not myself. Like I'm going to obviously ultimately still be making using my own brain, making my own choices, but there's the enjoyment of, there are things I can do, or there's motivations that I have within this world that are different than my own, and that's part of the suspension of disbelief of the experience. So I think there's a little bit of wiggle room there with, if I'm playing an elf or I'm playing an orc or some robot or some whatever it is, that inhabiting that character, I want to kind of fall into aspects of this race that I don't have in my own life.
Yes, and I think that's where a lot of RPG settings that provide alternate races, is what they really are using them for, as I said, is to provide a set of characteristics that are attached to the race, to give the player the opportunity to play characters that really express those characteristics. It's a framework, it's a starter pack essentially for character. And I think I've just become a little more disenfranchised with that, because it does create very samey characters over time, and especially within something like D&D. I mean, I would say I haven't seen too many original orc characters, and I haven't seen too many original gnome characters. All of the characters within either of those races that I've seen players play, they tend to be very, very similar, versus if I see characters who are just playing, or if I see players who are just playing a character and there's not a thought to the race, if the race is not attached to it beforehand, the creativity of concepts and personality traits especially that go into that character tend to be of a much larger variety. And so I just think it's interesting, like what bounds get placed on creativity by the genre. So an example of what I was just saying that I want to put at you is, again, within the work that you've done within the Lovecraft mythos, where there are some very distinct elements that are attached to kind of cosmic horror that tend to define, creatures within that genre in particular.
Yeah.
And so the eyes, the tentacles, face tentacles, especially, things like that tend to be really just the founding archetypes of creatures within that genre. And so, as I understand it, this piece in particular that I'm showing right now was one where you're really commissioned to show that Lovecraft mythos. And so you're creating an original piece that does draw directly from those archetypes. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, this one was really exciting for me because I do like Lovecraft's mythos, his stories a lot. And this is the same company that I did Netrunner with. This was the book cover, this large hardcover book cover for their Arkham Horror. So it's like, I guess it's a card game series, but this is a book about kind of the story of that. But they gave me total freedom, which was probably also because I worked with them before, and because I said right up front, oh great, I love Lovecraft, I'm very familiar. So I was able to essentially do whatever I wanted. And I think I'd mentioned this to you back then when I was working on it. I just had too many ideas. I think I had 150 or something, whatever, a lot more than I normally have, because there's so many directions it can go. But what I was most interested in, and in a way this is probably a perfect example for our conversation, because the trimmings and the details of the Lovecraft mythos are very familiar. They're specific and they're familiar, and they include, like you said, the tentacles and cosmic horror and eyeballs, and there's like a creepiness, there's an unsettlingness,
shadowy alleyways.
Yeah, dark cloaked figures. But the thing that I tasked myself with, because if you're saying you got one shot, communicate the Lovecraft mythos. What I have seen, we've all seen, because the look of the Lovecraftian world is so familiar. Like, we see those specific aspects and we know what it is. There tends to be I've noticed an infatuation with really the rendering and the depictions of things which are really written to be mostly imagined. One of the things I think makes his writing as sort of, I don't want to say it's not flowery, but he's very like articulate and descriptive, but within that, he's I think one of his real skills as a writer is to put just enough information, and then essentially from there either say or insinuate it's just, it cannot be comprehended. So what I wanted to do, what I felt compelled to do, was, how do I make an image that captures Lovecraft but doesn't confine that world or that universe to one thing? So what I wanted to do was how do I communicate the theme of his work, which is really driven by a descent into insanity, right? Yep. That's like the overarching theme, is that these creatures, these demons, these monsters go beyond time and are incomprehensible to us small human beings. So that's why I think why this was fun for me and relevant here, is how do I pull in the visual cues to assemble something which, again, my goal was communicates a sense of something that doesn't make complete sense, that is dark and feels like you might be going mad. That's what I was trying to capture here.
I mean, you have eyes on eyes here.
Yeah.
There's something that's clearly like not right about that. And it suggests this fifth dimensionality to me of, the overlap and just the world kind of collapsing in on itself to some degree, which I think is.
I love, not to say that MC Usher is the only person, but he's so definitive in his work that is sort of like, his world is sort of like composite reality that pulls reality apart. And so anytime I have a chance to make an image that, I don't really have the words for this, but sort of like pieces something together that as it's assembled, I think it's a sort of the word would then be juxtaposition as part of it. So yeah, there's a man wearing, you know, a classic kind of Lovecraftian 20s, from the 20s, detective type attire with the fedora on, going towards a arched doorway, which is an eyeball. Like for me, that was a very satisfying composition, because I didn't sort of see it and then take it. I hadn't seen it before, so it felt very satisfying to invent that. But yeah, then it's sort of, but those elements still work and play appropriately from the Lovecraftian landscape.
So, I mean, in this piece, you're really drawing directly on a lot of those archetypes, and you've assembled them in a very original way. I want to contrast that to a different piece that you've done, if I can click onto it here. To me, this would also seem to be influenced by some of that mythos as well. But to my knowledge, this is not a piece that you created specifically for that.
Yeah, no, I just did a piece, yeah.
And so I wonder if you could talk about this piece a little bit, and maybe think through out loud some of the ways that Lovecraftian mythos and the works that you've done within that world might have influenced this design as well. Or feel free to tell me if I'm totally off base on that.
Well, I'll say this. So this piece was just I don't remember the exact what was going on in the world, but it was just something I just started painting. It just came very fluidly together. I was doing the figure, and then I painted the kind of opening up, which I was interested in exploring, because I've done a lot where the internal is sort of like an X-ray, like we're seeing like an X-ray into it. And this is, I was playing on the idea of, what if that wasn't just an X-ray, but was actually like the person was basically coming apart or being consumed by some kind of supernatural fire. And then once I had the figure, I needed to put him somewhere. Or actually, I had a version that was all white, and then I thought, well, this is the lighting, this is dark, I'll put him in a dark space. And then I just went through a lot of different ideas for what that could be, and settled upon, oh, he kind of feels, he could be anywhere. He doesn't necessarily feel like, he's not wearing an astronaut's outfit or anything like that. So then I thought, oh, that'll be interesting. I'll put him in more of a science fiction setting, an environment that feels spacey and somewhat futuristic in a very light kind of way. There's control panels along the bottom, but not in a way that's really prominent. And then once I had that all together, I thought it needs one more thing to kind of click, to kind of palette-wise, color-wise, but then also I wanted to kind of, basically, so that's the symbol in the hand, which feels a little bit more sort of like magic-y, esoterica. So if I'm sort of walking through my thought process here, it was almost a deliberate kind of, here's Annie, a deliberate kind of, not ping-ponging, but like navigating, oh, I'm going down this familiar road, or like genre-wise familiar. Okay, I want to go the other direction now. Oh, that's starting to look familiar. Okay, I want to go the other direction now. So really, this entire piece was, in a sense, my intention was, I'm aware of genre, I'm aware of how something looks like it's part of something, and generally speaking, I'll say my general MO, whether it's for stuff I'm hired for, or in this case, personal work, I really prefer to straddle, define genre and and I guess like totally unrecognizable out there abstraction, let's say. If that's the spectrum, yeah. So that's where how this came to be. It was aware of some lines of connection and basically trying to avoid them. So the end result, I'm not saying the end result is wholly mind-blowingly original at all, but yeah, I was trying to sort of steer away from it being specifically one thing. And in terms of Lovecraft, that's certainly present, but it definitely wasn't steered or guided by.
Wasn't a starting point for it.
No, not at all. Not at all. But again, we can't go from like, oh, I loved working on this Lovecraft cover to this piece, which was several years later, and me saying, no, there's no relationship at all. I mean, that's just where it starts to become, mixed in the stew of creativity.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I find a couple of things in your explanation there fascinating. One, this idea of playing within your own genre of your work, which is probably a horrible stretch of that word, but I'm gonna roll with it here. Of like you are aware of a lot of your work features this kind of inner light motif, and playing with this idea of, all right, where else can I take that? What if the light's coming out? And in fact, what if it's kind of destroying the person in the process of it? And then just kind of going from there and seeing where that took you. I find that really fascinating, and might be something we want to loop back to in a future conversation.
For sure.
The idea of the where these things are floating around in our subconscious, essentially, and a conversation that we've had on a number of occasions before about people's interpretation of your work versus your intent with the work, and you not wanting to put too much of your, like, not necessarily make your intent too clear. You don't want to dictate people's understanding of your work. It is my paraphrasing of what I believe you said before. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, and I think a lot of people would say this, like you make something, someone says, oh, I see this. Like I want, don't get me wrong, I want to correct them. I want to say, no, it's not that. but for all intents and purposes, like to make something and people to, generally speaking, get something out of it, even if it's not what I intended, it's sort of more fulfilling just the fact that people are responding and connecting with the work than the finer points of how they're interpreting.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I think that's interesting that your work gets to become a starting point for their own ideas, where I think part of the background of this conversation is kind of the suggestion that all of the work we've consumed in media is a starting point for a lot of our own ideas. It's all ingredients that become part of the mix. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that there isn't such a thing as originality. I don't believe that. But that their components come from places, right? What we see in the world defines very real, just physical structures that we work with. To go into what might be a little bit of a counter example of that, there were a couple of creatures that you've done.
This one, I forgot about this. It's been a long time since I saw this.
And this one.
Yeah.
These two, as I was looking through a lot of the work that you have on your site, which is a partial set of things in general, I would say are probably some of the most unique creatures that I have seen on your site. And you've got a lot of work that isn't creatures, right? But these two felt very original to me. And so I'm wondering if you would agree that these are original creatures, or if they might be based on something that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, no, they're not. They're totally original in the sense that they were not based on anything. This was I forget a collective, a gallery collective called Light Gray Art Lab that I do work with once in a while. I just did a piece for them that I'll be showing in a few weeks. They have these like group invitational shows, and so this is for a series that was called, I think it was called The Isle of Kismet, or The Lost Isle of Kismet was the premise. And basically, they had all these artists come up with imagery that could take place on this island. And there was a descriptive prompt, and I think that artists got some degree of, you're either making a creature or something else or a landscape, but there wasn't any more sort of specifics around anything other than it takes place on sort of like a fantastical island. And from there it was totally free. So yeah, these were just my intention. Like I really love having some sort of prompt or sort of even the lightest framework to respond to, and then from there, get off my back. I'll invent as much as I possibly can. So yeah, I mean the sort of the inventive process with both of these, which is an ongoing thing for me, is how much this is like just a real common thing. It's been for a long time, and maybe it'll change at some point, but it's been a common thing for a long time. How much can I depict or create, in this case, a living thing, an animal, that is perceived and related to as an animal, while at the same time, like how far can I define that, and how much at the same time can I don't want to say undermine that, but have it just be a painting. The relationship between a living, breathing animal and a white surface with a bunch of colored pigment on it, those two worlds are inherently opposite ends of the spectrum. And whenever I have a chance to play right in the middle of that is a place I enjoy playing. So this one I think particularly has that. It's just a lot of essentially messy paint composed in a graphic-y kind of strokey way, but then there's a little bit of, okay, I can see that this is like some kind of fang monster.
And so my question I'm wanting to explore now is very specific to what you just said. Why would you like for this creature to exist? What is the value that we as storytellers of a different kind both get and desire from wanting to have a creature like this exist within our world, versus just telling our players it's a magical jaguar, something like that? Like there are very clear archetypes out there that we can draw from, and if we just wanted to play a game with players, from my example, I could have it be nothing but archetypes, and the only original elements, the story that we're telling about how those archetypes interact with each other in terms of the plot. And even that, I can draw a lot from tropes and things like that out there. I have no interest in that. And I think most players wouldn't either. I think that we all want, as people, as creative people, something that has some familiarity to it, to where it's not totally incomprehensible, but also has novelty and newness and originality, and makes us feel like we're in a place that we haven't been before. I'm just curious to get your take on that, in terms of why you want to create creatures like this versus just 100 different versions of a magical cat. Be really clear, like cat photos are popular,
Yeah, I know,
if
I
your
like cats.
goal was
Yeah.
success, you could create 1,000 cat illustrations
Yeah.
and be the most popular guy on the internet.
Yeah, right. So this really gets at something that I feel like it is important to get across, which is ultimately my goal, and I'm sure there's overlap with RPGs, is really it is a degree of originality. I think that everyone who does something creative, what they're really aspiring for is connecting with other people, with providing something larger than themselves that that is some degree of a contribution to our culture. I think that is like a deep-seated driving force. And then, you know, like, but part of how that happens is this goal of originality. So when it comes to the topic of genre and how we utilize it, you know, painting dragons, and if you're having a campaign that takes place in a fantasy landscape that has some similar qualities to Tolkien's Middle-earth, we're using that as a way to exist with our gamers or our viewers in some sort of familiar enough space that we're enjoying the environment. But the real key is, for me, I think this is really important, that we're not doing the work to serve the genre. Our goal is not to essentially say, we're doing this for the genre. We're taking essentially what we need to create something meaningful and connecting and ultimately original is the goal. And I think that's really important, because what can happen with genre is this sense, I think that a little bit of a trap people can fall into, of trying to follow the rules that are set by the genre. But if you really just follow the pre-existing rules, like, what are you actually doing? Like, I think you have to take it one step further and twist things a little bit, because that's where you get into the place where you're contributing something.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I just think
it does. I mean, to me, this connects back to something that I feel like we were talking about at the very beginning of the conversation around dragons, and about how there is no authority around, you know, what dragons are or aren't. It's based on a shared understanding. But I think you just made the point that I would agree with. I think a lot of times people who are creating genre works, they are creating them as if there is an authority on the genre, and they're creating them to please the genre.
Yeah.
They're trying to create a good cyberpunk image, illustration, game, story, etc. They're not necessarily using cyberpunk themes and iconography to tell a good story. And it's interesting that those are very different approaches, and I think they lead to very different outcomes. Have your starting point in your response. You were talking about how the goal of creative folks, when we're trying to create original works, is ultimately to connect with others. And I do find that to be true for myself. I think you've answered one of my questions around why am I wanting to create settings in a certain way. It's because I don't want 10 years from now my players to be saying, oh yeah, I remember Jay ran this really great Lord of the Rings game. You know, that's just not my interest. This is a very ego-driven motivation, but my interest is much more in 10 years from now, I would love to have created a world and a game within that world where my players are still thinking about elements within that world and wanting to go back there.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, and this doesn't have to be a we thing, this might just be a me thing, how much of this is just a God complex? You know, how much of wanting to create original things and have people respond to them is just an ego-driven motivation of, you know, I want to have control of what I've created, and I want to put people in a space to where they're happy with me having that control. They're happy with what I've created because they couldn't come up with it themselves.
Yeah.
They could come up with the other things themselves. I'm not, you know, knocking on the player experience versus the GM experience, but to me, I think that is a sign of high praise if someone loses themselves so within your world that they're happy to not create. They're happy to just consume and want more of it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. Are we talking about God complex?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the appeal of GMing for sure.
Yeah.
Because
I can push back on that.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Right. So there's certainly that aspect to running a campaign for sure, and for painting, for writing. I think doctors have been, surgeons. People said they have God complex. I think the one thing that is really key here, if that's genuinely like a thought or even a concern that you've had, like, am I doing this just because there's like a power play, a desire for power? The thing is, though, is this goes back to what I was saying before about connecting. I don't think it's really a God complex, because I think if it was a God complex, that would be more applicable to wanting to be in control, but not being concerned with other people's experience, or particularly whether or not they have good or bad experiences. If you have a God complex,
right,
your only concern is for self-gratification of being in control. If people are happy or they are unhappy, it doesn't matter, because I'm in control. And that's where I think there's the God complex isn't applicable here, because when you're running a campaign, your goal is enjoyment, is stimulation, is fun. Absolutely, there's a degree of control and of stewardship and of running something, absolutely. But that's where I would pull apart the notion of something getting towards like a God complex, in terms of like, I think how we don't even know what a God complex maybe really is, but in terms of a general sort of feeling about what that means, I would say that's why.
What if it's a benevolent God complex? Like I hear your point about I care about the player's experiences, and maybe that's a counter to it's not all about my control and my satisfaction, for sure. But I think there is still an element potentially of like, I want to create something that they enjoy, and I want for them to enjoy a specific thing that I have created, and preferably even enjoyed in the way that I've meant for it to be enjoyed. And I hear echoes of that in what you were saying about how you were saying, don't get me wrong, when people say that they see certain things, sometimes I do want to correct them.
Right.
And so that's where I'm driving at. There is an experience that we're trying to create specifically. And in our ideal worlds and our imagined worlds, when we're in the process of creating these things, I think that's part of what drives us. Do you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree with that. But again, I don't think that there's it's a win-win. I guess that's the difference.
Sure.
Right? We get something, I truly, for me, the fulfillment is when somebody else is enjoying the work. Again, it's not like I'm getting something even if somebody else is not getting. If something is like, if it's affecting somebody, I don't know, like maybe negatively, then that would affect me negatively. So yeah, so that's where I'm just pulling that apart a little bit. I think the empathy, I think empathy is significant to this. I think that, for someone who is a sociopath, whether or not they're murdering people or not, but as I understand, a sociopath is not having the empathy experience.
Right.
They're doing things, other people are being affected by it, but it's not really affecting them emotionally.
Yeah, I'm not talking about a God complex in the sense of I just want to create a world and put people into it and puppet them. That's not my goal as a GM or as a creative of any kind. Right.
But I also am not going to say that you're totally wrong, because there's definitely something to that. You make something, I think authors all have this feelings, particularly in some degree of fiction, of like, I'm creating this world and I'm putting it out there and people are reading my stories and I'm having a relationship with my characters that I invented. Like, that's a huge ego boost. I mean, I think the experience of one's ego, the expanse that comes with that is probably pretty enormous and feels really good when you're successful in it. So yeah, I'm not going to say that doesn't exist.
I think that's one of the other things I'm playing with is the question of why you might want to use archetypes in certain situations, and in particular, there's a Arthurian inspired, Legends of King Arthur inspired campaign setting that I've been playing around with. I think I've talked to you about before.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Where one of the things I'm really interested in doing potentially is just using certain names that I feel like have a lot of backstory and gravitas attached to them, for the gravitas of it.
Yeah.
So I think when you put in two brothers named Cain and Abel into the background of a story, there's a lot of backstory attached to that. Even if I explain very different events that have happened with those characters, I think it still has a certain weight in the player's mind, and it conveys a lot of unspoken things about a rocky relationship and betrayal potential, and a certain sense of age, of oldness, ancientness, things like that. And one of the things that I see done with archetypes a lot is they get used to create specific feelings, and sometimes to the point to where it just no longer works. I think this is particularly common within horror. When a horror creature is used over and over and over again, it becomes too familiar and it's no longer horrifying.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think that's where the originality really plays a role, and we are constantly seeking to refresh or find new approaches to get that same emotional experience, and we're trying to create an experience within others that matches an experience that we've had through thinking in ourselves. And I think that might be a really common link between the work that we both try to do. Yeah,
totally. I mean, I would say that, pulling it back specifically to the notion of genre, the genre, when I got hung up, and I remember having this almost like an argument one time with this guy who was so, it was enlightening. It was like an enlightening conversation because he was so committed to genre in a way that really, it annoyed me and frustrated me, but I also had to really come to terms with his emotional connection to genre, because I like, as we've talked about, like, I think it's useful, and it should help us serve our intentions of storytelling. But I also, as I've already said, I feel like it can be too much to get too hung up on the specifics because they already exist. I think allowing in change and adaptation is really important. What was I going to say? Oh, I forgot my point. It was just basically that I think the notion of genre as if I'm making a metaphor here, genre as people is not as useful or applicable as thinking of the genre as clothing. I'm trying this out. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I've got an interpretation of what that means that I like, and the analogy works for it.
Yeah, you can put on the detective genre, you can put on the sci-fi, or more specifically the Afrofuturist or solar punk genre, and then within that, because again, I guess the reason why I like that as a quick analogy is because you're still having to relate to the person, and it can be any kind of person with any kind of need or desire or story arc. That's why we can hop around in between, fantasy or, comedy and tragedy and drama, is because they're all there to serve the person's story, or, the conceptual goal of, and like Lovecraft, as an example, he has people in the story, but but there's never like, the characters are never really the main thing, and they're never consistent through all of the short stories. He's more conceptual because he's dealing with the idea of incomprehensible ancient beings. So yeah, that's where I think genre is useful. And also, you know, the further aspect of that is that even to say how much of is Lovecraftian is tricky, because he's also pulling from the past, from, you know, Kafka and Poe and William Hope Hodgson, who not as many people know. He pulled a lot from him. And so I just have a bit of like a bone to pick with the idea of allegiance to genre, because there's infinite space for interpretation and invention. And I think if you have such a strong allegiance to genre, you're blinding yourself as a creative to your own potential of invention. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I like what you're saying about if you. This is maybe where the closed metaphor falls a bit short for me, because they're a little bit more constraining, I think, than I would maybe talk about, you know, genre is a seed, it's not the plant.
Give an example.
Well, just that sci-fi or Lovecraft or noir, those can all be starting points. And what ultimately grows out of them should be recognizable from the seed that it started from, right? If you're really trying to create something from a single seed, and I find it fascinating when people don't do that, and when they mix them, or where you know, they're not growing something based on a seed that we're aware of. But those plants can ultimately end up looking very differently, and to be too constrained by the idea of you know, a seed just grows the same way every single time, well, then what's the point in, you know, planting yet another? You're not being a creator at that point. You're being a manufacturer.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. I guess my overarching feeling towards genre is they're great as tools. They're great. I think they're important to be aware of. I think it's really important to be aware of our sort of cultural vocabulary that is genre. But at the same time, especially in any creative capacity, I think even just as like a viewer, just be aware that they're ever evolving. They're there when we need them, but they don't. We're not at the I don't think that we should ever feel that we're at the service of genre.
Yep.
Because again, I think that just creates like a limiting perception, because there was a time before Lovecraft, and now we refer to Lovecraft, and now people keep working within Lovecraft. But don't forget that, like, this is still like, you know, like a person's perception, and there's so much more room for going in different directions. In fact, as I understand it, or as I'm becoming more and more aware, Lovecraft, who is, I don't want to say notoriously infamous for being racist, has been co-opted by those people who he derided as taking his genre, his language, his sensibilities for themselves, which is fascinating, right? Because it works on like a meta level. Like their work, you know, Jordan Peele directing, producing the for HBO Lovecraft Country, which was a book which takes place in, you know, like it's Black folks dealing with the same fear and all the qualities of Lovecraft, even though he did not like Black people, and taking those same qualities because they fit perfectly with the Black experience, and telling their own stories in his language. So I think that's fascinating. So I think that kind of use something and then just disregard it, because that's how culture evolves, and that's how we are able to communicate, because we need to keep updating our language to really be heard and to be seen and to get our messages across.
Yeah, I think the point that you're making, I might summarize as genres have to evolve because we evolve.
Yeah, 100%.
Our world evolves. Yeah. And so, I mean, sci-fi at a certain point stops being sci-fi. We catch up to it in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so sci-fi needs to have new elements to it to continue being sci-fi.
Right.
I think we're unfortunately experiencing the same thing now with cyberpunk.
Yeah, totally. Right. It needs to keep pushing. Like, yeah, Gibson was a big cyberpunk pioneer back in the 80s. And then Matrix really brought it up into cultural perception. Him, and obviously he had a lot of other, wasn't just Gibson, he was involved, but we also had a lot of philosophers they were pulling from. But yeah, times keep changing. And I think one of the challenges we face in 2020 is that our invented stories, our sci-fi hasn't, at least in a kind of universally accessible way, portrayed some of the challenges that we're dealing with misinformation and with Corona. We have, obviously we have like zombie movies and post-apocalyptic movies, which we can have some reference for. And we have Orwell, which we're still pulling from, which is, I think, a testament to the brilliance of a man who wrote a book in 1948, was published in 1949, that it's still applicable. That's impressive and powerful, but damn, we need more stories that can really help us navigate the current issues of miscommunication and disinformation, because it's unlike, I think, anything that's been perceived. And maybe this exists in small ways, but I think this is where we need to really draw from our storytellers to transcend genre, or to use genre, and to help us conceptually, intellectually, emotionally be prepared for real life challenges.
Yeah. And so I think that also is a useful answer to one of my earlier questions about why not just create a story that is nothing but the archetypes that already exist.
Right, exactly.
It's really just because if you're doing that, you're telling the same story that's already been told, and there's not a new experience or new learning from it.
Right.
And you might as well not do it you might not do it yourself because it won't be as good as the things that you're drawing from often.
Right. Yeah, but that's where it's key, is because you're living now, dealing with real current issues and concerns, and this is sort of a battle cry, or a bullhorn to everyone out there. Like, that's what you have to say. It's hard. It's really hard to make something meaningful and significant. It's really hard. But that narrative in our head that says, what can you say? You're a fill in the blank. What do you have to contribute? That is what we have to contribute. We're experiencing this stuff now. We have strong feelings about what's going on now, and drawing from the vocabulary of what exists before and what exists in terms of genre. That's a great delivery mechanism.
Vocabulary is a good word there, because I
like using vocabulary when it comes to this stuff. I feel like that gets it across really well.
A lot of the stories within established genres that are new stories that I like, they are telling an original story using the elements of an existing genre to communicate something that I think that the authors or creators wouldn't be able to articulate as well without that genre. You know, it ends up being something to where if I'm experiencing a certain feeling in my life or in the world, that's the type of conversation that I think almost everyone struggles to have with others.
Yeah.
But when you tell a story using familiar elements, still conveying your own emotional experience or perspective on the world, I think it becomes much more accessible to everyone else. And so I think that's, to your point, genre is clothing. It's a useful tool to communicate what you want to communicate.
Absolutely. I think that what you just said is absolutely the most useful way to think about all this stuff. I think it's the most empowering ways. How can I pull from the kind of the cultural tropes and the cultural language and the cultural touchdowns so that what the stories that I want to tell, or what I think is important, can be received? Because we as human beings, we share this very weird thing, which is we all feel like we are, or maybe a fear of the way that what makes us different, right? Especially I think we face this when we're in our teen years, feeling like, oh, I just want to fit in, I just want to be accepted. But because everybody has that feeling, it's pretty profound that that's also what makes us the same. Like we all have that. So to feel this insecurity around creating something or telling a story is understandable, and that's where drawing from this big pot of options of this vocabulary is how we can essentially like guise our points, our feelings and our concerns, so that other people can a dragon, I like dragons, and then they're now having an experience because we're relating over the shared guise, and then within that they're now getting something current and relevant and personal and sincere.
Yeah. Well, man, I feel like we could talk for hours about this in just so many different ways. But I think this has been a really good conversation that just for time, we should probably wrap up here. Adam, thanks so much for just answering all of those questions, sometimes very off the wall questions, and dealing with all of my assumptions about your art. I love just like throwing assumptions at you and see how you very like reasonably patiently like go with like, all right, some of that might be accurate, but here's the things that I'm going to just like shift in a different direction. That was very good.
Well, I always love chatting, buddy, and I always appreciate you pulling stuff out of me that I didn't know was there. So great chatting. Where can folks find you if they want to learn more about Neely?
For me, the best place is probably my Twitter account, Jay in Boston, just a letter N, and that's where I'm doing all of my creative gaming related tweets. How about you? If they want to find more of your work, which I know that they will, where can they find you? AdamSDoyle.com is my home base website, and then all the other social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, is all Adam S Doyle. Cool. All right, man. Great chatting with you. Hopefully do it again. Thanks everyone for listening to us.
Thanks for joining in. Yeah, hopefully. All right. Take care.
Catch you later, pal.
All right, buddy.
Bye.
Bye.